What if the necklace sitting in a felt pouch at the back of your dresser, the one you have never once considered getting looked at, is worth more than your car? A woman in Ohio had exactly that. It had been valued at nothing for 30 years. It sold for $61,000. Most old pearl necklaces are worth almost nothing, and I am going to tell you that plainly, all the way through this list. But a handful of them are worth 100 times what anyone in the family ever guessed, and the difference comes down to a few things you can check tonight, standing at your kitchen counter without paying anybody a dime. Let's find out if yours is one of them. Here is what nobody sat your grandmother down and explained. Before the 1920s, every pearl on earth came out of an oyster by pure accident. A grain of sand, a parasite, a bit of grit, and the oyster spent years responding to it. The odds of that happening, and of a diver finding it, were so low that natural pearl necklaces were priced like real estate. Then culturing came along, a technique for inserting a bead nucleus so the oyster does the work on command, instead of by chance. And by the 1930s, the entire natural pearl trade had collapsed under the weight of a cheaper, predictable substitute. So every strand in every drawer in every house in this country sits on one side of that collapse or the other. Strung before the mid-1920s, it is very likely natural. Strung after the mid-1930s, it is very likely cultured. One of those is worth a car payment. The other can be worth a house. Your mother did not know which one she had. Neither did the man at the pawn shop. That is not because either of them was foolish. It is because nobody teaches this, anywhere, and it is not written on the box. Think about how strange that actually is for a second. A used car has a title. A house has a deed. A gold ring can be weighed on a scale and priced within a few dollars by anyone with a jeweler's scale. Two necklaces can sit side by side on the same square of velvet, look identical to every eye in the room, and be separated by a factor of 100 in value. And nothing about their surface will tell you which is which. That is not a flaw in your judgment. That is simply what this category is. It rewards the people who know exactly where to look, and it punishes everyone else equally, rich or poor, careful or careless. So tonight, we go looking 10. The costume strand, nobody insured. Small pearls near the clasp, larger ones in the middle, a color that has gone a little cream, a little yellow, honestly a little tired looking. Most people glance at that yellowing and file the whole necklace under costume jewelry without a second thought. That instinct is reasonable. It looks its age. But age is not the same thing as worthlessness. And the yellowing you are looking at is often just what silk thread and decades of skin oil do to a strand that was never meant to be flashy in the first place. A regional auction house in the Midwest listed a plain graduated strand 2 years ago with a low estimate of $600. It closed at $19,000. Here is your test. Hold the strand up to a bright lamp. Let the pearls hang free. And look closely at the hole where the silk passes through each one. If you see a thin white shell sitting over a chalky core, that is nacre wrapped around a bead. And you are likely holding a cultured strand of ordinary value. If the material looks the same all the way through the hole, no visible seam, you may be holding something considerably older than you assumed. Do not stop at one pearl. Check 3 or 4 along the strand, because bead nuclei can be small enough on an old strand to hide well, and one clean-looking hole is not proof of anything by itself. 9. The single pearl pendant with nothing else on it. One pearl, no halo of diamonds, no maker's mark you can see with the naked eye. No box. It reads like a confirmation gift, a sweet 16 present. Something bought without much thought and worn twice. Because there is nothing decorative surrounding it, most people assume there is nothing to it at all, and it gets priced at $0 before anyone thinks to measure it. But dealers who buy natural pearls quietly will tell you that an unmounted or lightly set natural pearl over 10 millimeters is treated as a genuine rarity, priced individually rather than as an afterthought hanging off a chain. A ring holding a single 1.5 millimeter natural pearl sold at a London auction a few seasons back for 10 times its top estimate. 10 times. So, lay the pearl flat on a ruler with millimeter markings, or better, borrow an inexpensive plastic caliper from anyone who quilts or beads. Under 8 millimeters, keep your expectations modest. Over 10, you have a real reason to keep going. I have watched this exact pendant get handed across a counter and priced at almost nothing, simply because nobody in the room had ever thought to measure it before naming a number. 8. The strand where every pearl looks hand-matched. Before culturing existed, matching a strand meant sorting through thousands of wild, oddly shaped pearls to find enough that were close enough in size and color to sit beside each other convincingly. That kind of hand-graduated sorting took actual time. And time like that was not spent on jewelry nobody expected to matter. A 19th century natural pearl necklace went up for sale at a European auction house with a top estimate around $10,000. It brought in nearly 4 times that. Here is what people miss. They look at the graduation, the way the pearls step up gradually, toward the clasp, and back down again. And they assume it is decorative styling. It is not styling. It is evidence of labor that only made economic sense on natural pearls. Run your finger along the strand slowly. If the sizing steps up gently and consistently, rather than jumping in obvious size groups, that gradual hand matching is worth paying attention to. A cultured strand can be graduated too, but it is almost always machine sorted into clean, even jumps, while a hand-sorted natural strand tends to drift slightly, because the sorter was working with what nature actually produced, rather than a catalogue of standard sizes. 7. The strand with more metal on the clasp than on the pearls. Somebody in the family gets a quote on a bit of old platinum with some small diamonds, and the appraisal starts and ends with the clasp because that is the part that photographs well and catches light. But think about that from the other direction for a second. A jeweler in 1920 did not spend real platinum and cut diamonds dressing up pearls he considered cheap. The clasp was never the asset. The clasp is the receipt for what the jeweler thought the pearls themselves were worth at the time. An Art Deco necklace with natural pearls and a diamond-set platinum clasp sold at a Boston auction house for well over $100,000, and the clasp itself, on its own, would never have carried that number. Turn the clasp over under a jeweler's loupe or even a strong phone flashlight and look for tiny stamped letters or numbers. If you find a mark, photograph it before you show the piece to anyone, and write down exactly what it says, symbols included. 6. The lumpy, irregular strand somebody thought was a mistake. Off-round, a little bumpy, definitely not the smooth marbles you picture when you hear the word pearl. Somewhere along the way, somebody in the family had these set into a brooch or a ring, and everyone since has quietly assumed it was done because the pearls themselves were not good enough for anything better. That assumption feels obvious. We are all taught that round and symmetrical means valuable, except with pearls. That rule runs backward, more often than people expect. A pair of irregular Baroque natural pearl earrings sold at a major auction house a couple of years ago for well over $250,000. Irregular, in that case, meant the pearls had grown entirely on their own, with no bead ever inserted to force a shape. Hold the odd-shaped one under a lamp and turn it slowly in your fingers. You are watching for the luster to seem to move underneath the surface, rather than just bounce off the top of it. Set it beside a smooth, obviously modern strand and compare. Side by side, the difference in how the light behaves is usually obvious within a few seconds. 5. The battered box nobody bothered to open twice. The hinge is loose, the velvet is worn through at the corners, the silk lining inside has gone grey with age. It looks like packaging, and packaging is the first thing that gets thrown out during a house clean-out. But a specialist appraiser working an estate case reviewed a platinum necklace from the early 1900s, set with natural pearls and several carats of old-cut diamonds, still resting in its original fitted box with the maker's name pressed into the silk lining. That family had the necklace itself valued decades earlier for a fraction of what it was ultimately worth, once the original box confirmed who had made it, and roughly when. The box on its own adds very little in dollars. What it adds is proof, the one surviving clue to a maker, and a decade, that the necklace itself cannot tell you by itself. Tilt the lid under a lamp and read the lining at an angle, because embossed lettering fades to almost nothing under flat light, and becomes readable the instant the light rakes across it sideways. Check the base of the box too, and the underside of the lid. since some jewelers stamped their mark into the wood or leather rather than the silk. And it is the first spot anyone throws away without turning over. The strand that is suspiciously perfect, every pearl exactly the same size, exactly the same round shape, exactly the same soft glow, nothing out of place from one end of the strand to the other. That perfection feels like the whole point of a fine necklace, and for a long time people were taught to want exactly that. A bead nucleus produces a predictable, repeatable result almost every time, which is precisely why culturing exists. Wild oysters do not cooperate that consistently, ever, which is why genuinely matched natural strands are treated as unusually rare rather than the standard. So, a flawlessly matched strand is very often the signature of skillful culturing, not of nature. I will not oversell this one. A pearl dealer's public buyback rate for an average cultured strand under 10 millimeters sits in the range of a few $100s, sometimes less. But there is a twist worth knowing before you write the strand off. A signed Mikimoto strand at 12 millimeters sold at a Midwestern auction house for close to $45,000, and a 1970s signed Sartois from a major French jeweler brought nearly $50,000 the same year. Cultured, both of them, no natural pearl involved at all. The name on the clasp did the work that the pearls alone could not. Check the clasp for a stamped signature before you assume perfect means ordinary. Even a partial signature, a single letter, or a worn logo you can barely make out is worth photographing and researching. Because a house name can turn a strand that looked like retirement fund fiction into a genuinely sellable piece. The grey, bronze, or brownish strand assumed to be dyed white. Not white, not cream, but grey, or a deep bronze, or something closer to chocolate. Families almost always assume a coloured strand has been artificially dyed and mentally file it under costume jewellery without a second thought. Sometimes that assumption is correct. Most dyed freshwater strands really are worth very little, but naturally coloured pearls, meaning oysters that simply grew that colour on their own with zero human help, are treated by the trade as some of the rarest material that exists. And a certified natural, multi-strand necklace in grey and brown tones once brought over $5 million at a New York sale, confirmed by an independent gemological lab as entirely untreated. The test for dye is not glamorous, but it works. Look closely at the drill holes and any tiny surface pits under strong light. Dye concentrates unevenly in those spots, so a dyed pearl often shows visibly darker specks right at the hole, while the rest of the surface looks lighter. A naturally coloured pearl tends to show even colour everywhere, hole included. Even colour throughout is your reason to request a lab opinion, rather than assume the worst. It costs very little to send a single pearl for testing compared to what it costs to sell an entire strand for scrap, because everyone assumed dye without checking too. The necklace that is missing pieces and nobody noticed shorter than it should be, or oddly light for its length, because somewhere in the family's history a jeweler pulled several pearls off the strand to make a pair of earrings, or a child's bracelet, or a repair on something else entirely. Everyone since has assumed the shortened necklace is simply worth less, because it is incomplete. And on paper that logic makes sense. Here is where it gets expensive to be reasonable. A historic necklace once shortened from its original count, sold years later at auction, for a fraction of the price it fetched, after collectors tracked down and reunited the missing pearls, restrung to their original full length, and the completed piece brought over $5 million, nearly double what the shortened version had sold for, only a few years earlier. So before you accept a low offer on a short strand, go open every box, every envelope, every tissue-wrapped bundle in that same dresser drawer. Those stud earrings from the same grandmother, the ones nobody thought to connect to the necklace, might be exactly what was taken off it 50 years ago. Reunited pearls are worth more together than the two pieces ever were apart, because matching is the entire game in this category. Lay the necklace and the suspected earrings side by side on the same white towel under the same light, and compare size, color, and luster pearl by pearl, rather than glancing at them from across the room. The plain, unremarkable strand everyone was ready to give away. This is the one almost every family owns, and it is the one that costs people money in both directions at once. Some women take $40 for a plain strand that turns out to be natural. Far more women hang on to a plain, cultured strand for decades, convinced it is a retirement fund, when its honest resale value is closer to a few $100s. Both mistakes come from the same blind spot. There has never been an obvious visual signal separating the two, and there still is not to the naked eye, not even to most jewelers standing at a counter. The only fully reliable answer comes from a gemological lab, using real-time X-ray imaging, which shows a natural pearl as concentric rings all the way through, and a cultured pearl as a solid bead at the center, with nacre layered around it outside. That image is the entire distinction, the whole 100 times gap, reduced to rings versus a core. Everything else on this list, the drill hole, the caliper measurement, the hallmark, the dye test, the missing pieces, is not the final answer. It is simply the evidence you gather to decide whether the lab report is worth paying for. A plain, never restrung strand is actually your best candidate of all, because plain usually means old and untouched means the silk, the knots, and the clasp are still telling the truth about exactly when it was made. A specialist appraiser once looked at a graduated natural strand from the 1870s and put its value at $5,000 to $7,000, adding simply that pearls like that came straight out of the ocean with no human hand shaping them at all. Not 5 million, 5,000, but $5,000 for something you were one draw clearing away from donating is a very real number in a very real life, and it is a number that only exists because somebody finally picked the strand up and looked at it, instead of walking past it for the 30th year in a row. Before you clear out a single draw, before you accept a single offer, before you let anyone tell you what your grandmother's necklace is not, get a ruler and a lamp and look at it yourself tonight. Measure the largest pearl, check the drill hole, read the clasp. Open every box in that drawer at the same time, because the missing half of a pair is sometimes sitting 3 inches away and nobody ever noticed. Your necklace sits on one side of that early 1900s fault line or the other, and everything else follows from that one fact. None of the tests on this list cost you anything beyond a lamp, a ruler, and 20 minutes at your own kitchen table, and every single one of them beats guessing, or trusting the first number a stranger offers you across a counter.